It's infrastructure deficit. Well, I mean, because of infrastructure deficit, particularly, I mean, the lack of connectivity and all these things, I mean, the trade cost is very high. Unless and until we address, I mean, these issues, I mean, it doesn't matter whether you are in BIMSTEC or whether you are in SAFTA or SARC. And another issue, I mean, both SARC and BIMSTEC, they are facing the same problems. That is institutional capacity deficit. I mean, well, we have SARC secretariat, but it doesn't have any, I mean, mandate to monitor or evaluate, and also to evaluate the implementations of the agreed upon, I mean, activities or agenda. And we are facing the same sort of, I mean, institutional deficit even in BIMSTEC. So here, the point is, unless and until we address these problems, fundamental problems, I don't see, I mean, any change in the scenario, despite, I mean, we become member of any regional organizations. Okay, I stop over here.
Thank you, thank you. So 4 key words: asymmetry, responsibility by India, political, the way the politics of the region is proceeding, and the initiative must come from India. Well, let me now turn to, I'll come to you, Dr. Saleri, a little later. Let me turn to the institutional representation here with Dr. Ratna being here. Can you respond to some of, not respond to the response, but the question?
Thank you, sir. Actually, I was wanting that some of my time I will use in responding to them, to 2 of your questions. The first question, which relates to the trade war, we do understand that it will have implications, because these 2 are 2 major economies in the world, and when the fight happens, definitely it impacts countries. But there are now studies which are coming up, and that is where perhaps this region is not reaping into, is this brings opportunity to this region. If US is raising duties on China in aluminum and iron and steel to such an extent that China is not in a position to export to US, some of the countries in the region which are producing these can see it as an opportunity of exploiting the US market, which earlier they were not, because the Chinese prices were more competitive. And that will also create what we have been debating in last 2 days also, about a regional value chain within the South Asia. And so I do agree India has to take a lead, but then becoming a part of Indian value chain would be very, very important for the countries therein. The second issue of the lack in the regional integration, and I have heard about, you know, to an extent I agree with Poshraj that we are quite sentimental, and I mean, we get swayed away with our sentiments when we talk about regional cooperation. But we need to also learn lesson from other regional integrations. ASEAN, EU, NAFTA, where they had no problems whatsoever at a political level or economic level. They did. They had so much problem among themselves, but they looked at the overall welfare of the regional cooperation, and to a certain extent we gave in. They did not purely look into the regional cooperation with the lens of purely trade or export or balance of trade. If you look at ASEAN, look at the commitment of the LDCs in ASEAN and compare with the commitment of SAFTA LDCs. There, the CLM countries have liberalized 98% of their trade with the other ASEAN 6. Here, when we talk about SARC and BIMSTEC, most of the items which could have been traded are kept in the negative list of the countries. Now, at one point of time, you are talking about trade, promoting trade, and on the other side, when you are putting up the policies or negotiating an agreement, and you are putting it in such a manner that the trade doesn't happen, how do you expect it to happen? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, yes, that sounds very optimistic, and I would love to go by that perspective. Yeah, it's India definitely is the largest country of the region, and therefore has to necessarily bear that additional responsibility of seeing integration in the region. But clearly, we can't be waiting for a political moment to arise, and therefore, are there options? I mean, can we, in a manner, and I remember in 2012. There was a golden moment of this region's trade relationship, particularly India-Pakistan. And those of you who would recall the manner in which cement-related trade moved from Pakistan to India, and correspondingly in other products from India to Pakistan. And we were at a point, now I don't want to bring in politics in this discussion. But clearly, you saw that there was a huge effort at the level of the industry, businesses, academia, and research community to bring up this whole perspective and element of the need for divorcing politics from economic cooperation and trade. Why are we not seeing the same impetus once again? Can I raise this to Dr. Saleri?
Well, I think in our region, economy is being derived by political economy. And of course, you can't, in theory, we can say that we have to divorce politics and trade and economy. We can keep them in separate boxes, but in reality, we know that so far we are not successful in doing it. Part of the reason is perhaps whenever we want to do something in the region, and especially I'm talking in the context of Pakistan, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Afghanistan, one thing that we need to do before we carry out any step, we shouldn't release it to the media. So any positive intentions from any government, any country, whenever they want to do something on a bilateral basis or even on a trilaterals, the moment media picks it up, and we know that our media is polarized, so in each of these countries, so you will find some media houses which are pro-government, some media houses which are pro-opposition, some media houses which are otherwise. So the moment these things, they go to the media, I think government comes under extreme pressure, and at times they have to change their stated position and they have to take U-turns. So my suggestion would be that if, and I agree with you, of course, trade and political differences, those have to be kept separate, as China and Taiwan, they can do it, and we can see many other examples as well. But it is not happening so far in our case. Do you remember that People's Party government, Zardari government was fully convinced to give MFN status to India, which we should have given. And then the message was sent from India to Pakistan that the elections are too near, and granting this MFN status to Congress government would be perceived as pre-poll intervention or pre-poll rigging from Pakistan. So it should be deferred. And it got deferred, and now, of course, conditions are not conducive enough to do it again. So I would say both the governments, they are mindful of the fact, I know there are sane voices everywhere, they are mindful of the fact that political differences and trade and economy and regional value chains, those have to be kept separate, but we should not let other actors getting involved in it prematurely and getting the whole process jeopardized.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, that was a very interesting dimension, this whole, the question of whether it will be perceived as rigging by Pakistan. We came into 2016 when in the American elections, we talked about, people talked about rigging by Russia and elsewhere. So we were, in a sense, leading the pack. Anyway, let me turn to Dr. Vignaraja. How do you see, I am very conscious of the fact from the earlier speakers that, well, yes, there are a whole lot of impediments and, politics is coming in the way. But can you just disassociate yourself? I know the political, the connect of politics with this. But Ratna brought in a point that there are a whole lot of other regions who, despite the political aberrations, have integrated very well. And every country in in those regions has been always forthcoming in participating in the process, because in the long term they have seen their mutual gains. Can you give us a sense of where is South Asia heading towards, or are we still cooking ourselves in that old broth of politics, non-tariff barriers? Because my subsequent questions are of the new age. And if we are not still trying to move out of this conundrum of politics and political economy, then how are we going to address those challenges? Because those challenges, will, as a matter of fact, decimate the South Asian region despite being the most populated region.
Thank you very much, Chair. So I see two interesting issues in all of this. The first one relates to market-led integration, which I think has a new opportunity amidst this trade war. You see, what it does is you have the two giants, US and China, which are dancing, right? And what that will basically do is decelerate China's growth further from the 6% that people are predicting to something under 5.5. That's what the number you'll get. And with that, and the restructuring within China, labor costs are rising, other costs are rising, the value chain can now spread. And we've just done a study, which is on the website of the Lakshman Kadirgama Institute with the Overseas Development Institute in London, that discusses in great detail what the restructuring will be. The study is called Asia 2025, Prospects for Middle-Income Countries. And the value chain restructuring goes like this. Essentially, China will begin to shift its labor-intensive bits to other countries. And we are seeing clear evidence of that. It's coming to India, it's going to Vietnam, and it's going to Indonesia. These are the three major players where this is going, right? And the other South Asian countries can be potential entrants to that labor-intensive part of the value chain if they do certain things right. And again, we looked at this in great detail, and there are no secrets in some sense. One part of it is the wage productivity link, right? Wages in some South Asian segments of industry are quite high relative to those productivity, and that's very clear. A second one concerns barriers to foreign investment and behind the border regulatory barriers. Very clear issue. A third area concerns trade-related infrastructure and logistics as well as IT infrastructure. So those are clear issues that the rest of South Asia needs to deal with if it wants to get into those value chains that are now even more footloose than before, right? So I'm less pessimistic about the trade war for South Asia, except perhaps India, which has raised tariffs, I believe, on US goods. So that's a different story. But for the smaller countries, there is an opportunity. So on that, that's one story. And then there is a second value chain that we discuss in this study that is also happening. China is moving up the value-added ladder, right? Through a tech story with much more of the domestic supply happening in China. So you have a second value chain that will be tech-oriented, right? With Japan and Korea that are increasingly spending on R&D to levels challenging the United States. So there's a second value chain in which there is some opportunity for the Indian BPO sector and the IT sector, for the other countries in South Asia that are increasingly involved in IT and other things. So these value chains, I think, are very interesting prospect, and South Asia can integrate through others in this way. The second brief point, if I just might say, is I think we need to think of a new architecture of cooperation. And on the institutional front, there is a conference in Sri Lanka on the 10th and 11th of October, which is next week. It's about the Indian Ocean as a new future. And what that tries to do is to look at East Asia and the Pacific, South Asia, and Middle East and Africa as a big area of 28 countries. And we're looking at maritime security, which is an increasing issue, and the Sri Lankan Prime Minister talks about this. He doesn't want South Asia and the Indian Ocean to become the South China Sea, right? So maritime security linked with economics has a new dimension, and I think we should look at that, and I hope from the Colombo conference, we will have a new way of looking at this cooperation, which is hopefully renewing it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that lovely, very forward-looking exposition. Let me take this at this point to Dr. Ram Upendra Das and particularly ask him, how does he see the emergence of a value chain-based cooperation in South Asia, both in terms of what has been done so far and what are the prospects. So that is the first point. And the second point, which I'll of course like the others to also answer, is this second dimension of a new institutional architecture, a potential institutional architecture. And the Indian Ocean rim, and how does it integrate, or rather how does it allows integration of the South Asian region? How can that break this jinx, and can that break this stronghold of political economy on the region, and so on. So first the value chain, Dr. Das.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, let me thank the organizers, ESCAP, SASIPS, and RIS to have given me this opportunity. I'm again very delighted to be in the company of my old colleagues, seniors. About your questions in terms of the prospects